welcome to everyone. I would first wish to thank the entire Dartmouth Political Union executive team, as well as Darshana Griggs and Catherine Dara, for all of the work that went into making this event a reality. For those of you that have not been to Dartmouth Political Union events in the past, we're the premier club on campus devoted to bias-minimized, nonpartisan discourse. Our union aims to bridge the divide between the culturally diverse and politically diverse coalitions on campus and create an understanding environment of free thought and expression. We host speakers on topics that we believe are of the utmost relevance at the present moment, or on topics that are not being paid enough attention to in the present. We further host student debates and numerous social events on campus for our student body. Our speaker tonight is in a sense best described as a public servant. Glenn Greenwald has been warning about the threat of authoritarianism and government overreach since the Bush administration, and he has been at the center of some serious investigative journalism, which includes the now famous Snowden papers. In 2013, Foreign Policy named him one of the top 100 global thinkers. In 2014, he founded The Intercept with the hopes of creating a media entity that is independent of market and corporate pressures. He recently left this entity due to what he believed were serious violations of this principle. Most importantly, Glenn runs the Hope dog shelter in Brazil, where he hires formerly homeless people in order to take care of now more than over 26 dogs. You can find Glenn on Substack at greenwald.substack.com. While the DPU is extremely excited to hear Mr. Greenwald's thoughts, we would like to stress that the DPU never endorses any of the views its speakers share. We aim to be unbiased and unbeholden to any ideology or entity. The event tonight will start with a 20-minute prepared speech by Mr. Greenwald, followed by a 20-minute moderator-guided question and answer, and will end with 20 minutes of your questions. In order to submit a question, please find the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen and type your question in there. And also make sure to upvote the questions you really like. If you do not wish to ask your questions directly using your voice, you can ask the question anonymously. It is important to know that this event is being recorded and your questions may be uploaded to YouTube. With that, I would like to welcome Mr. Glenn Greenwald. Mr. Greenwald, the floor is yours.
Hey, good evening, everybody. And thank you so much to the DPU for inviting me to speak. I'm really honored to be here. And thank you, Vlado, for those generous opening remarks as well. Just to correct one important thing, important to me at least, our dog shelter actually has, I think, around 400 or 500 animals now, dogs particularly. 26 is the number of dogs that my husband and I personally have in our house, who are also all rescue dogs. And in fact, the shelter was a necessity for me to open because my husband's threatened to divorce me if I picked up one more dog from the street. So that's the backstory on that. I've been asked to talk about authoritarianism in the US. It is something, as Vlado indicated, that I've been working on for a long time. And before delving into it, I just want to very briefly define what it is that I at least understand by authoritarianism. I think it's important to have a good working definition of whatever terms we're tossing around quite a bit. It's not a very scholarly one because we don't have enough time for that, but it's kind of the crux of it for me, which is authoritarianism happens whenever an individual or a group of individuals is persuaded to relinquish personal autonomy or personal freedom to an institution of power, an institution of authority, in exchange for some perceived benefit. And authoritarianism can happen essentially in any societal sector. It can happen culturally, institutionally, at an institution like a college or university, and obviously can also happen politically. And when it happens politically, I think one of the principal hallmarks of that exchange is that what is relinquished by the individual to the institution of authority are civic freedoms, civil liberties, typically in exchange for some guarantee of security or safety. It might be physical security or other kinds of safety. And one of the reasons it's so effective as a political tactic is because we as human beings are biologically constructed to crave security. And that makes a lot of sense. If we weren't craving security, if we weren't craving safety, we would constantly be in danger and we would have a great deal of surviving as a species and as individuals. So it's only natural that it's something we want instinctively. So when someone promises that to us, security and safety, it's something that we are drawn to. It's something obviously that we're born in. The fetal womb provides that kind of protection. We're protected by our parents throughout infancy into childhood and adolescence, and sometimes even into young adulthood. So we're trained to crave it as well, societally, beyond just biologically. So something we really can be easily convinced to pursue. And the easiest time to convince us to relinquish personal autonomy in exchange for promises of increased security and safety is when we fear that we're in danger. And this fear is also a critical part of who we are as humans, how we're constructed. Fear is what alerts us to the fact that danger is lurking. But because fear is an emotion, it's something we experience as an emotion, like all emotions, it's very easily manipulated by others. And it is not that hard to artificially elevate fears in order to artificially depress perceptions of safety and security so that institutions of authority can more easily convince us that we're in need of increased safety and security because the dangers are higher than they really are. And that is typically the formula for how authoritarianism takes root. Sometimes those fears are rational, sometimes they're real. In fact, oftentimes, if they're going to be effective, they're grounded in some kind of grain of truth, some actual danger. It's not like it's a danger that's non-existent or that it's fabricated. The tactic is to inflate the danger, to exaggerate it, to make it seem like it's more proximate, to make it seem like it's more existential than it in fact is, to increase our fear levels and therefore our willingness to acquiesce. Now, as Vlado said in the introduction, I was working as a lawyer for 10 years after I graduated law school in 1994. So through the 9/11 attacks into, say, 2004, 2005, I was working as a lawyer in New York, and I lived in Manhattan on the day of the 9/11 attack. I lived and worked there, and I remember it very vividly. I remember how high fear levels were afterward, but more or less within a matter of months, those fear levels began to recede and rational thought began to return. But the fear levels were so high because that event was so cataclysmic that the perception that we were in need of much greater levels of security and safety than we previously had was very pervasive, even months or even a couple of years after that attack. And so as a result, authoritarianism really took hold. We were convinced to give up all kinds of rights to privacy. Legislation like the Patriot Act was very quickly passed with very little debate, despite vesting in the government previously unthinkable authorities of monitoring and surveillance. An entire surveillance state was constructed. All kinds of unprecedented detention theories were created where the president could just unilaterally declare someone to be a terrorist and then deprive them of due process, even if they were an American citizen on US soil. And that's what actually impelled me to want to leave law and start participating more in the public discourse, was my belief that authoritarianism was severely on the rise. And I started a blog in 2005 in response to that. And it kind of is what fostered my journalism career. And I never really stopped focusing on the threat of authoritarianism because although the war on terror itself is kind of sputtering to an end, I mean, it's hard to say that when we have troops in Afghanistan going on the 20th year, bombing multiple Middle East countries in the name of that same fear, but it's certainly not as at the forefront of our collective minds as it was even, say, 10 years ago. It's really kind of diminishing, but the threat of authoritarianism is not, because as often happens, other fears are identified and then inflated and exploited to ensure that the population stays quiescent to this central bargain that defines authoritarianism. So you can look at different kinds of authoritarianism. One is authoritarianism imposed by the state, and the other is imposed by non-state actors, by the culture, by institutions. And I think we see a rise of authoritarianism pretty severely in both cases. So let me start talking first about the rise of authoritarianism on the part of the state. It has been kind of stunning to me to watch a lot of smart, rational, sober people invoking 9/11 or the prior cataclysmic event on US soil that could be compared to it in terms of fear levels increasing and authoritarianism subsequently imposed, including the detainment of Japanese American, the internment of Japanese Americans on US soil, which was the Pearl Harbor attack. People are now routinely invoking Pearl Harbor and the 9/11 attack to suggest that the riot that took place at the Capitol on January 6th is similar, if not necessarily in duration, in terms of its severity, in terms of the danger that it signifies or that it revealed. And there are lots of people in different parts of the political universe calling for what essentially would be a second war on terror. This time, not one directed at foreign terrorist organizations, but one directed inwardly, domestically, at domestic terrorist organizations. And there is legislation pending, which has been pending for quite a long time prior to that January 6th Capitol riot, that would essentially do nothing other than take the existing war on terror legislation that was enacted in the wake of the 9/11 attack and that was directed at foreign terrorist organizations and that vested the government with immense power to take action against any organization that they decreed unilaterally without due process to be a foreign terrorist organization, and simply amend it to say, and domestic terrorist organizations, and domestic terrorist organizations. So it would simply implant the war on terror right on to US soil. And the way that that is being engineered is the very same formula that I described previously. I think any decent person looks at what happened at the Capitol with a good amount of disgust and horror. Anytime there's political violence introduced into our polity, it's always a alarming event. And whenever a mob beats to death a police officer with a fire extinguisher, there's some really bad people who are involved who deserve to be held accountable in pretty severe ways. The problem is that our political discourse has become very binary. It kind of only admits two choices, where you either have to say, I regard what happened at the Capitol as no big deal. It was just a little protest gone awry. I think people were mostly peaceful. We shouldn't really be concerned about it. Or the other extreme, which is this was a coup attempt, an insurrectionary riot, something designed to topple the legitimate government of the United States and to end American democracy. And I think both poles, both extremes are equally unhinged, but particularly the one that suggests that the United States, the most powerful country in the history of the world, with the most paramilitarized police force on the planet, was ever in any meaningful danger as a result of a few hundred people entering and breaching the Capitol, such that words like insurrection or coup are even in the same universe as the reality. It may be that some of the people had insurrectionary intent, but the idea that we were facing some kind of grave existential crisis for the democracy is, to me, completely unrelated to the actual reality of what took place and what continues to take place. There were all kinds of reports that on Inauguration Day, we should expect to see armed attacks and armed protests at the 50 state capitals around the country. None of that happened. None of that materialized, nor have there been violent attacks in the name of this insurrection since January 6th. But I think what you're seeing is that same formula being applied, which is persuading people that they are in more fear than they're actually in, and then offering them security and safety in exchange for giving up an enormous amount of their civic liberties, their civil liberties, their civic freedoms to this institution of authority, the FBI, the Justice Department, the United States government, the CIA, the NSA, all the standard security state agencies that are designed to offer American citizens that bargain at any moment. And I think, just like what was done after 9/11, whether it be the invasion of Iraq or the implementation of a torture program or the creation of a due process-free zone at Guantanamo, you can go back before 9/11 and find lots of people advocating all of those things in the name of Islamic terrorism. And 9/11 kind of became the justifying event that vindicated the views of those who were calling for it. The same exact thing is true here. I've been giving so many interviews over the last year where people say to me, once Trump is gone, what is it that media outlets are going to do to get people to pay attention? What is the political class going to do to keep people's fear levels high so that people want to keep giving power? And it was so predictable. It was so obvious what was going to happen, which is that even once Trump was gone, the claim was going to be that there's this grave menace domestically lurking within the United States, the enemy within, called right-wing domestic extremism or domestic terrorism. It's a very exciting story. People get scared by it, so they stay tuned because the adrenaline levels are high. And that narrative always was going to take hold with or without the Capitol. It just turned out the Capitol event ended up being the perfect accelerant for that theory. And I think we are now faced with a very serious authoritarian threat, which is the idea that a second war on terror, one that began before most of you were cognizant of what was going on, in fact, perhaps before you were even born, is now going to be replicated, but this time with much greater dangers, because it's going to be aimed not at foreign state actors or non-state actors, but at our fellow citizens. And that always presents new dangers. Then there's the threat posed by, or the threat of authoritarianism posed by non-state actors. And in the United States, it's very difficult to talk about state actors over here and non-state actors over here as though they are completely distinct entities. When you're talking about, say, corporate censorship or Silicon Valley censorship, which we're seeing rise significantly in the name of a lot of those similar threats, the idea that they're completely separate is really mythological. Obviously, many of the people who are currently in government came from those corporations. Those corporations fund both political parties. There is all kinds of constant revolving door exchanges between government and corporations. They work together cooperatively in all sorts of ways. One of the things we revealed during the Snowden report was that the NSA was working cooperatively with the 5 or 6 largest Silicon Valley tech companies, including Google and Yahoo and Facebook, to gather user data without the public having been aware of it. Corporations do employ huge numbers of former government officials or aides who now work on K Street as lobbyists, who can open doors so that they can just walk in and write legislation. So I don't want to talk about state authoritarianism and non-state authoritarianism as though they're completely distinct, because they're not, but they are two different kinds of dynamics. And non-state authoritarianism is taking place often at the prodding of state officials like politicians or regulators or people who work in state government. Oftentimes it's done at the agitation or instigation of journalists or activists. But essentially what we're obviously seeing is the internet becoming much more constricted in terms of what is permitted. And I never thought I'd be a person who would begin a sentence this way, but when I was your age, 5 years ago or 7 years ago or so, the internet was much, much different than it is now. When the internet first emerged, it was characterized by complete anonymity and complete freedom. There was no such thing as moderators telling you what you can and can't say or removing your postings. There was no ability to connect what was posted on the internet to your actual real life identity. You could use the internet to explore anything. All kinds of dissent and creativity was possible because there was no monitoring of who you were. Nothing stuck to you, who it is that you were. And there were certainly no speech codes or no commercial or corporate constraints imposed on what you could do and say over the internet. And over time, these constraints, as the internet became a more powerful tool, began strengthening. And I think one of the fascinating things that we see now in the last week with this fascinating story that I'm sure all of you have heard about, with a bunch of retail investors gathering together on Reddit anonymously on a subgroup, on a subreddit, to essentially exploit the rules of Wall Street to transfer billions of dollars from hedge funds to these individual investors perfectly legally, just exploiting their system, is the kind of thing that when we talked about the internet in 1998 and 2000, that was what excited everybody, was it would empower individuals to engage in collective action to eliminate radical power disparities between ordinary individuals on the one hand and ruling class elites on the other. And that clearly is something the internet continues to provide in terms of potential. And that's for exactly that reason, that there is now a much greater attempt to control it, to constrain it, to limit it. I found it fascinating that obviously over the last couple of years, the primary excuse for censoring people off the internet or removing them completely is this amorphous concept that they're engaged in hate speech, which we can talk about when we have the Q&A session, if you want. And then this week, a major platform, Discord, decided to, on the very day that this subreddit was starting to really scare and sabotage and undermine hedge fund billionaires, decided to ban them, not on the grounds they insisted, perish the thought that it had anything to do with this uprising against Wall Street, but instead because they found what they called hate speech on the subreddit and therefore needed to ban it. And that is increasingly becoming the tactic that these institutions of power are using. They don't care about hate speech. They don't care about civic discourse or eliminating ideas that are dangerous to marginalized people. That's not their concern in the slightest. That's their pretext for getting you to be concerned, for getting you to be scared, so that you give up this civic right that so many people have fought for so many years, which is a free and open internet, because they know that a free and open internet is one of the few instruments remaining to challenge ruling class power. And the only way they can neutralize it is if they can get you frightened enough to voluntarily hand over to them control over how it can be used, what it is that can be said, and what purposes the internet can be used for. And we are absolutely seeing that vividly in a very rapid ascent. Just very quickly before I end, I mean, if you look at the last 4 months alone or 3 months alone, for me, the three most extraordinary examples of how rapidly the censorship online is increasing is the example of Facebook and Twitter in the weeks before the election uniting to ban any discussion of reporting on the Bidens by the New York Post. They didn't take the position that it was unreliable or misguided, which isn't really their place to do anyway, but that wasn't what they did. They just censored it. They just used their algorithmic control or just brute force to prevent citizens from discussing this reporting in the weeks leading up to the election about the presidential frontrunner. After that, in the transition, they removed the president of the United States from almost every single major communications forum, which caused many world leaders who have no affection for Donald Trump, Angela Merkel in Germany, leading French officials, AMLO in Mexico, the leftist president of Mexico, to say, this is extremely alarming what Silicon Valley is doing in terms of the power they're asserting to even now remove democratically elected leaders, because they're essentially positioning themselves as more powerful than nation states and as the unilateral determiners of what discourse we can engage in, of what information we can access. And then finally, 2 weeks ago, Amazon, Apple, and Google, three companies, three of the four that a House subcommittee 4 months ago said were classic monopolies, united to simply remove from the internet a social networking platform, Parler, on the grounds that people on Parler had participated in organizing the January 6th Capitol riot, when in fact there was much more planning of that event done on platforms like Facebook and even Google's own YouTube. But the framework has now been created where they can just remove an entire social media platform and have most of the public thank them for it, because the fear level is sufficiently high that people are convinced that it's being done for their own good, to give them safety that they need and crave and are otherwise lacking. So if you're somebody who cares about authoritarianism, who thinks about it, who wants to understand how it works, I think the key that you always have to go to is to use your critical faculties to ask whether or not the fear that's being cited and flagged is being described rationally or not. That's our responsibility. We all have fear as an emotional response to the world around us. And just like any other emotion, rage, anger, jealousy, we have the obligation to keep it in check, to make sure that it's not being triggered in an irrational way, in a harmful way, or allowing others to manipulate it without our knowledge. So let me thank again the DPU. I'm really thrilled to talk about this. It's obviously a topic that I'm very enthusiastic and excited about, and I'm happy to take your questions. I look really forward to them.
Well, that was great. Thank you very much. So I think you touched upon several very important topics here, but the first thing that perhaps I would like to speak a little bit more on was that there is this growing sentiment, and both on the left and the right, that it's more than just authoritarianism, that the system is rigged against the little guy, going from the Wall Street bets thing that you mentioned and onto a plethora of other issues. So what are your thoughts on that? And if the system is rigged, then what can people do about it? It seems that it's a losing situation.
Well, I don't see how anyone can rationally dispute that Wall Street is a rigged game in favor of the richest and most powerful. And I found it super interesting that with this conflict between Reddit on the one hand and hedge fund billionaires on the other this past week, it was almost no division between how the left and the right responded to the conflict. Almost everybody was cheering the Redditors because it's so rare for Wall Street to be beaten at their own game. And that's exactly what happened. So everybody knows that it's rigged. I think the most tumultuous and significant event of your lifetime, and maybe even mine, is the 2008 financial crisis, which was about nothing other than Wall Street tycoons exploiting their political power to deregulate that system, and then place enormous bets that they kept winning on and winning on and winning on, and enriching themselves to the most obscene extent, which is, if that's the rules, those are the rules. But then the minute they placed bets that collapsed, they didn't suffer any consequences. The government stepped in and saved them from ruin by using taxpayer dollars to bail them out, and at the same time allowed huge numbers of ordinary citizens to have their financial futures ruined, for there to be a foreclosure crisis, for people to be buried in college debt with no prospects for how to get out of it. Something that continues to this very day. You guys are going to probably get out of college and your job prospects are going to be infinitely worse than the prior generation, when the American dream was always the next generation always does better. And people are furious about that. They're angry about it. And so the question of what is it that we can do, we saw what can be done this week, which is that ordinary citizens band together on the internet, and without regard to, no one was asking, what's your politics on abortion or LGBT rights, or do you consider yourself a Republican? No one cared about that. People were united in rage over what this industry has done to people's economic future. And they banded together based on that rage, based on that righteous anger. And they used the tools of the internet to equalize that playing field. And that's the reason you're seeing so much panic and so much terror on the part of Wall Street hedge funds and their media spokespeople, and increasingly politicians who they fund, because they know that's a serious threat. And you're going to see all kinds of steps taken to neutralize it, no matter how illegal it might be, like suspending trading arbitrarily, to drive down the price artificially, to look for ways to manipulate the market until the government can step in. So, I continue to believe that a free and open internet is the most important tool that we have. That's the reason I fought against surveillance. That's the reason I fight against censorship now, because this is the instrument that can enable us all to have a fighting chance.
Touching upon that thought of unity, do you believe that there is enough unity in the Congress currently to be able to starve off such attempts? Because as you know, even Ro Khanna and AOC have supported the parlor removal. And on the other side, you have people like Liz Cheney, who I'm sure would be very supportive of the attempts to bring forth these bills on domestic security. So is there enough of a resistance in your view?
So people in Congress are subject to the same forces culturally and societally and politically as we are. And there is a monumental effort to ensure this left-right dynamic, this left-right schism, is something that benefits ruling class elites greatly, because they don't want us all joining together to talk about Melvin Capital and Citadel and hedge fund short sellers. They want us watching AOC and Ted Cruz exchanging trivial insults with one another on Twitter and staying in our red and blue corners like high school football fans cheering for our favorite football team and hating the other so that we forget about them. And members of Congress are no different. They can succumb to those same drives. We're encouraged to view Washington not through an analysis of power and power dynamics, but through an analysis of partisan warfare, even though so often the parties are in agreement with each other, especially the establishment wings. And, there are encouraging signs. I mean, one of the things that I actually was really encouraged by was the people who are pushing this new domestic war on terror legislation are people like Adam Schiff and Liz Cheney, as you said. It will for sure get the support of establishment members of both parties, but a bunch of left-wing members of Congress, led by Rashida Tlaib and Elian Omar, which I found very notable, people who actually had a personal connection to the abuses of the first war on terror and don't want it to come here. But they were joined by people like AOC and Barbara Lee, and I think 5 of the 6 squad members who signed, and a few others, signaling their willingness to work with the Republican Party to say, we don't need it or want another domestic war on terror. We don't need to put more powers in the hands of the FBI. That's the kind of coalition unity that I think is critical to see. But the problem is the passions, these partisan passions, as artificial and thin, deep, and superficial as they are so easily inflamed. We have different media outlets for each parties. They're over here in each corner. I found it kind of annoying and disturbing that there was this left-right unity in response to the Reddit hedge fund conflict. And yet it immediately broke down when Ted Cruz said he agreed with AOC's call for an investigation to determine whether hedge funds were manipulating the market. And then she suddenly turned around and said, you tried to have me murdered 2 weeks ago. Get out of my timeline. I would never want to work with you. Kind of prioritizing her own anger about that event over what was a really unique opportunity for people to join together to combat Wall Street corruption. And I just see that as kind of a broader reflection of the society that we're in, to which they're not immune. So that too is something we need to combat.
And I presume, because you've been criticized widely for going on Tucker Carlson's show, but I presume, or you can tell us what the strategy is behind that. And I think you just touched upon that. What are the core principles that guide you to sometimes ardently defend people that you probably disagree with very strongly on many issues?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, I think that if you say that you have strong political convictions, that you see things in your society that are damaging and unjust and want to combat them and make them better, which is something that you necessarily say if you aren't politically engaged, if you work in politics, if you work in journalism, then automatically I think that you have an incentive, if you really mean what you say, if that's really what you're motivated by, not careerism or other material benefits, but a genuine desire to foster change. If that's really something you believe, you're going to seek to maximize the number of people that can hear what you're saying and with whom you can communicate and work, not minimize the number of people who hear what you're saying. So obviously, if I'm given the opportunity to go and speak to an audience of 5 or 6 million people, I have 2 choices. I can say, no, I'd rather just ignore them, hope they go away, just don't need them to ever hear from me. Or I can say, no, I think the opportunity to go on and speak to those people and maybe persuade 10% of them, 15% of them, and not even necessarily persuade them to agree with me, but persuade them to be open to dialogue and to trust the things I'm saying so that we can have dialogue in the future, is unbelievably worthwhile. If I were to reject that, I would be utterly self-indulgent and I think even kind of fraudulent. But I think the more important point is the one that I was alluding to earlier about going on to Carlson or having these cross-ideological dialogue, which is, if all we're ever going to do is sit in our various corners and say, this is my team, I'm only willing to talk to them, everybody else who doesn't agree with me on fundamentals is evil or bigoted or irredeemable or whatever, we're always going to be a minority. You're never going to build a majority on any individual issue. You're always going to lose. You may feel good about losing. You may feel like you lost with your purity intact. But I think purity is something that you should worry about if you're an artist or a poet. But politics that doesn't change the society is inherently bad politics. And so I think, it would be kind of hypocritical for me to say that we have to learn how to break down these artificial ideological and partisan divisions and then refuse to talk to people with whom I have different views.
Thank you. You yourself are no stranger to authoritarianism, nor to the media complex and how it works. But I assume that many of us, and many even in our audience, are not trained and adept at dissecting when they're seeing a legitimate news reporting versus when there is a secret agenda potentially behind that. So do you have any tips, any clues that people should look for when they're watching TV or following the news that can help them discern whether they're being misled in any way whatsoever?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things that shapes how I look at things is, prior to becoming a journalist, when I was a lawyer, I wasn't particularly political. but I paid attention to political news to like an ordinary extent. I lived in Manhattan. I subscribed to the New York Times. I read the New York Times in the morning. I subscribed to the Atlantic and the New Yorker. I read those on the weekend. You know, I thought I was reasonably politically informed, that I was consuming high-end political news. And then when I started being able to work on politics and journalism full time, and I didn't have to rely on what those news outlets were telling me was happening about events or what documents said, I had the time and the ability to go read those documents myself or to go analyze those events on my own. I realized that there was this enormous gap between reality and what they had convinced me was true. That these are highly propagandized models of disseminating information, not because they are villainous people, you know, rubbing their hands together in some like James Bond like villain way, consciously aware that they're doing it, because they're immersed in these institutions and they believe the things they're saying, but what they're saying in these institutions are so siloed off and have such clear interests that everything that they're processing, the prism through which they're processing the world, is so subjective and so specific that it's just automatically distorting what it is that they're understanding and then what it is that they're telling you. So obviously not every person can have the ability to spend 10 hours a day or 11 hours a day reading documents, but nonetheless, I think it's imperative that we work to see things critically, right? Like when I think about college and the experience I had in college, the thing that was most valuable is not any specific thing that someone told me. It was the ability to start understanding how to read things on my own and to ask whether or not what I'm being told was true. And one of the most, I think, important innovations of new media journalism, journalism that migrated from the written page where there's enormous space constraints to the internet where there are no space constraints, is journalists are expected when they refer to a document to provide a link to the document that you can click on and go read yourself. And the more invested you are in a particular opinion, the more strongly you feel you're right about something, I think that's exactly when you ought to seek out really smart people who see things completely differently than you and listen to it with an open mind. And if you are convinced afterwards, it'll only fortify your convictions, but also make sure that you are believing things because you yourself have verified the foundations of those beliefs and not because so many people around you have drummed those into your head that you just start assuming they're true without actually knowing.
Thank you. With that, we'll transition to our two final questions. So my second to last question is, a lot of people view the United States as the world's moral leader on questions of authoritarianism and on questions of journalistic freedoms. And you seem to be implying that that's not the case. So I was just curious if you could first elaborate on this view. And secondly, have you ever in your life held this view? Is this something that you used to believe and no longer believe, or?
For sure. I mean, growing up, I was subject to the same teaching, and I went to a public school system and was taught that, you know, at the time it was the Soviet Union, that the United States was the free country, the Soviet Union was the repressive one. It was kind of a battle of good and evil. The United States was founded on these noble principles, and the Soviet Union doesn't allow basic freedoms to its people. That the wars that we fight are designed to liberate and not to repress. Those, of course, are all things that I believed into my adulthood, because you have to combat you're so bombarded with those claims that you really, before you even have defenses to them, they're already implanted in your brain, and you start interpreting the world through those assumptions before you even have the opportunity to decide whether or not you agree with them. That's what society does, is it implants these matrices or frameworks into our brain that ensures that we're seeing the world the way that society wants us to. It's what it means to be a political animal, is we're part of that kind of a collective. But then the more you start really understanding about what the United States has done in the world. I mean, I live here in Brazil for 15 years now. And in 1964, Brazil had a fledgling center-left government that was democratically elected, not remotely communist, just kind of vaguely socialist, like a kind of Bernie Sanders style socialism, some land reform, some rent control. And the Kennedy and the Johnson administration, two Democratic Party administrations, were furious because they thought Brazil was moving too close to the orbit of Moscow, and so worked with right-wing generals to just overthrow the government of Brazil, the democratically elected government of Brazil, armed the generals, gave them military support, chased the president out of the country, and then imposed a military dictatorship that ruled the country savagely for the next 21 years until 1985, from 1964 to 1985, killed dissidents, exiled journalists, banned any dissent, all of that. And that's like that's a very mild Cold War case when you compare it to like what the US did in Indonesia or in Chile or many, many other parts of the world. The dictators and the tyrants that we support all throughout the world still, that were the most important partner to the Saudi regime, to the Egyptian dictatorship. But then even civic freedoms, it's very easy if you're not actually a dissident to believe that your society is free, because if you're not really threatening power, of course, you're not going to feel attacked or besieged, because there's no reason to attack you or to try and persecute you, because you're not posing any threat to power. There's a famous quote often attributed, I think apocryphally, but nonetheless, to Rosa Luxemburg, the socialist activist who was murdered by the Germans in the 1930s, that she said, "He who does not move does not notice their chains." So if you're somebody who's kind of a good citizen, goes about your business, doesn't bother anybody, of course you're going to think you're free, even in the most repressive society, because you're not trying to do anything that society dislikes. And that's why I always say that the measure of how free a society is not how it treats its good, obedient citizens, but how it treats its real dissident. So people like Julian Assange, who's currently dying in a British prison despite being convicted of nothing, or Edward Snowden, who's exiled in Russia, and if he stepped foot outside Russia would be subject to the same treatment as Julian Assange. Go and do something that really threatens power, as like these Redditors are doing, and then see how free you are.
That's quite a dire warning. But while I would love to keep discussing these truly amazing topics, I just have one final quick question, hopefully that will benefit everyone. I would like to ask you, which 3 books influenced most the man that you are now? Or alternatively, what 3 books would you recommend that all of our viewers read?
Well, so there's this last book that I'm like 90% done. It's called The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium. It's by Martin Gurry. That is amazing because it is essentially a book about how digital insurgency campaigns can work to challenge power in a truly destabilizing way. And we just saw over the last week what we were discussing, the most perfect expression of that book's thesis. So it's kind of amazing that I happened to pick it up and begin reading it right as these events unfolded. In terms of the last question, I would say the person who shaped me most politically at the beginning of my journalism career was probably Noam Chomsky, simply because in terms of combating propaganda about what the United States is and the role that it plays in the world, there are a few people who have done that in a more scholarly and a more thorough and critically minded way. He's written 60 books. I'd be hard pressed to recommend any one of them, but from like 2002 to 2009, he wrote, I think, 6 books on American power and the American role in the world. And I would recommend any of those in terms of those questions.
Thank you very much. With that, we will transition to our audience Q&A, and the first person that we have is William Riker. Will, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much, Vlado. And thank you so much, Mr. Greenwald, for speaking with the DPU and the Dartmouth community today. So my question concerns, how do we balance our right to free speech with the need to prevent, legitimate threats of violence that we see in this country? What can be done to prevent extremists who get pushed off a social media platform from simply moving to a less moderated platform where their views might become even more radical?
Yeah, whenever people ask me about censorship, there's an ethical component to it, and then there's a strategic component to it. So you asked me about the strategic component. Let me just address quickly first the ethical component, which is the idea of removing violent extremists from social media. I think is a much more difficult endeavor than it might sound when you phrase it that way. Like if you talk about violent extremists, it implies that those are easily identifiable, kind of like, you know, tall and short people might be easily identifiable by measuring them objectively. Makes it seem like, oh, that's a violent extremist. Obviously, we all agree on that. The reality is it's very difficult to define what is a violent extremist. One of the first bits of reporting I did on growing online social media censorship was in the end of 2017. I was able to do reporting on how Facebook has been mass removing from their platform a bunch of Palestinian activists and Palestinian journalists because the Israeli government submits lists to Facebook of Palestinians it claims are inciting violence, are violent extremists. And oftentimes it's nothing more than saying the occupation of Gaza or the blockade of Gaza, the occupation of the West Bank is unjust. We have the right to resist it. Just like if Iranian or Russian or Chinese troops were on US soil, we would all say we have the right to resist that. That's regarded as violent extremism. And in almost every case where the Israeli government submits those requests, those are removed. Lots of people think Antifa and Black Lives Matter protesters are violent extremists because they have an extremist ideology, according to those people, and have proven that they are willing to engage in violence in pursuit of those ends. Other people might think violent extremists are the kind of people who advocated violence at the Capitol. And so I think we need to be extremely careful that we don't assume that those kind of judgments are easy ones to make, and especially don't assume that they're objective judgments. It's all a question of in whose hands this power resides. Because so often you may think that you know who the violent extremists are, but the people who are wielding that power and making those judgments might have very different ideas about what constitutes that. And then on the strategic point that you asked, I think it's a really good question. For example, the people who are planning the Capitol riots on Parler obviously have been driven off Parler because Parler was basically removed. When they were planning it on Parler, it was all out in the open. Now they've migrated to platforms like Signal and Telegram, which are encrypted, which you can only access if you are invited into these groups. And so the ability of law enforcement to monitor what they're saying has now been obliterated because they've been censored. And I think the much bigger question is, let's just assume that you are somebody who is a supporter of President Trump, who believes in the ideology of America First or MAGA or whatever, and you're seeing things like President Trump himself being removed from all these social media platforms, huge numbers of people who share your same ideology being kicked off these platforms with no due process, very arbitrarily, no transparency, everything's opaque in these decisions. You even see that the social media site that opened specifically to allow you to express yourself freely itself has now been removed. If you just keep denying people an outlet to be heard, to express their views, where do you think that energy is going to go? They're going to conclude that there's just no outlet for them to agitate for change through ideas, and they're going to turn to violence. So I think both in terms of the ethics of that censorship framework and the strategy, it's a very dubious proposition to start empowering these institutions to censor people on those grounds.
Our next question is by an anonymous attendee, so I will read it. Given the censorship, what are some of the sources of alternate news sources that you suggest to students who are just starting to get involved in politics?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I have worked in mainstream corporate media outlets. And so I've been on all of those networks many times. So I know how narrow the range is of ideas that are aired. So if all you're doing is availing yourself of mainstream sources, I can guarantee you that you're depriving yourself, not necessarily of the truth, because you may find that mainstream ideas are more persuasive, but you're depriving yourself of the opportunity to make that choice for yourself, to realize that there's this whole universe of ideas out there not permitted to be aired on these mainstream outlets that you might find very appealing, or that might at least inform and instruct how you think about the world. So I think it's very important in the first instance to make sure that you're deliberately seeking out sources other than the easiest ones to find, what happens to appear on TV or in the most prominent newspapers. And then as I said before, I think if you're on social media, if you're putting together a list of sites that you regularly read that might not be very known. What I do is I purposely look for smart people who have politics and ideology that I hate, so that I'm forced every day to hear their arguments about what they're seeing. Because that way I'm assuring myself that I'm not thinking what I think, because I've deliberately insulated myself from any challenging provocations. I'm deliberately seeking those out, which gives me more confidence in the views that I have, or sometimes it actually makes me think twice about whether or not the things that I'm thinking are the right ones. That's what I think is your obligation if you really want to challenge yourself.
Okay, the next question that we have is also anonymous. So if authoritarianism is your primary concern, what stops you from just becoming a libertarian? How do you draw the line between these civil liberties and what libertarians consider economic liberties?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I try and avoid labels of any kind, because they tend to be reductive and kind of trap you into a set of thinking. But I would, if to the extent I've ever had to choose a political label for myself, I would choose civil libertarian, which is not the same as the question recognizes as being an economic libertarian, in the sense that I generally tend to side in defense of individual rights and freedoms against incursions by institutions of authority. Free speech, due process, a free press, all the rights that are guaranteed to check abuses of power by authoritarian institutions. When it comes to economics, a lot of libertarians always ask me, well, how is it that your theory doesn't apply exactly the same to giving power to the state to control our financial and economic lives? Doesn't that yield the same authoritarian abuses? And my answer is, it's an interesting abstract question, but it's not one that needs to be resolved now for this reason. And I actually just talked about this last night with Tucker Carlson, and a couple days ago on a video I did analyzing this GameStop Reddit story, which is, if you look at how left-wing economic theory is traditionally understood and described, it typically, at its core, advocates intervention into the economy on the part of the state for the purpose of benefiting the lives of the people who have the least, the neediest people, those who are the lowest income earners, to distribute income to them and wealth and provide better services through taxation. Right-wing economic ideology in its traditional sense, including libertarianism, but also orthodox Reaganomics, says the opposite, says we don't want any intervention in the economy by the state. Let the free market work itself out through laissez-faire economics. What we have now is neither of those. It's not like we have right-wing economics or left-wing economics. We have a government, a state that intervenes constantly in the economy. That's why all these corporations pay lobbyists huge amounts of money to influence what the government does when it intervenes, to ensure that they're the beneficiaries of that intervention. So we have constant intervention. It's not right-wing libertarianism, right-wing economics, but it's also not left-wing economics, because the state intervention is not being done to benefit the neediest, but to benefit the richest and the most powerful. That's who are the beneficiaries of that state intervention. At best, what we have is crony capitalism. So I think the left and the right have to be unified in opposition to this crony capitalism. And once it's uprooted, then you can have that debate about, can the free market really provide a decent minimal standard of living that we are all happy with in terms of living together in a society where maybe people are starving or without access to healthcare? Will the free market provide them that through the natural mechanisms? Or do we want to ensure that we have some kind of minimal standard of living that everyone in the society is entitled to by virtue of being a member, because that makes a better society? Those debates then can be had only once what we have now, this like monstrous bastardization of both theories, is defeated.
Thank you. And we have yet another anonymous question, which is there a fundamental difference between right and left-wing authoritarianism?
I mean, the obvious answer is the kind of answers itself by definition. I suppose right-wing authoritarians would be imposing authoritarian power for right-wing aims, left-wing authoritarians for left-wing aims. That has been the case, for example, if you look at right-wing authoritarian regimes in, say, Chile, which had as one of its goals this kind of pure free market capitalism, and it crushed dissent and imprisoned dissidents to protect that system. And then, of course, there's been left-wing authoritarian governments in Cuba and North Korea and Venezuela and other places, to varying degrees, China, that are designed to protect the left-wing vision. But in the United States, I don't really see much difference any longer between right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism. I see left-wing authoritarianism as being very similar to what I would have described as being right-wing authoritarianism 10 or 15 years ago when I began writing about politics. Especially over the last 5 years, left-wing politics has come to identify itself with institutions like the FBI, the CIA, the security state, even police power, notwithstanding the protest of the summer. And although there may be different ideological ends that are part of the ultimate blueprint, I think the differences have really diminished, so that right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism doesn't really express itself all that differently, which is exactly why I think that, Adam Schiff has a lot more in common with Liz Cheney than he does with Ilhan Omar, and why I think Liz Cheney has a lot more in common with Adam Schiff than she does with Matt Gaetz. There are these two strains of authoritarianism that have kind of merged for very similar ends and definitely close to identical tactics.
Thank you. So our next question is from Jayanth Opaluri. Jayanth, would you like to ask your question?
Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Mr. Greenwald, first of all, thank you for coming. I've been a big fan of your work since the Snowden days, and it's really an honor to be able to ask you a question. And so I understand I thought it was illuminating the way you talked about authoritarianism today, especially with the second war on terror being waged because of strong language like insurrection or coup. But it is an equally authoritarian concern that the president of the United States was attempting to overthrow the results of an election, and that he was able to convince thousands of people that this was a legitimate thing. And how can we as citizens work to combat this authoritarianism?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it because I know it's on a lot of people's minds. So I guess I'll just refer you to the experience I had being a critic of the first war on terror, where I would anytime I would argue against surveillance or Guantanamo or rendition or due process free detention or drones, what I would hear is something similar, which is, look, there really are Islamic radicals who want to come to the United States and blow people up. And that's scary. And it's not just scary, but that too is authoritarian. They want to impose their ideology on other countries and are using to kill innocent people in order to achieve that vision. And I couldn't deny completely that existed. I mean, after 9/11, there were mass casualty attacks on US soil in the name of that cause. It's not like you could say it doesn't exist. There are no Muslim radicals in the United States, in the world, who either want to come and do violence in the United States or are capable of course there were. That was a threat. It was a threat. The issue to me, though, was the threat was wildly exaggerated to the point where people thought that the very existence of the United States was imperiled by these terrorist groups that were a tiny fraction of the force and size and resources of the United States government and its allies around the world. So the issue wasn't for me to say that doesn't exist, that's not a real danger, it's not a real threat. It was a threat. There are lots of threats. The idea was it's not the kind of threat that necessitates radically transforming the society in order to combat. You combat it through law enforcement, through the proper existent means of how you deal with criminality. So that's how I very much see the recent set of events. I don't think there was ever a moment when we were close to having a legitimate election overturned. Of course, it was dangerous for somebody like the President of the United States with the following that he has to try and convince people that the election was fraudulent. We saw how that can lead to violence and other uprisings. But if you look at what's been called an insurrection in the past in other countries and even here in the United States, think about major civil wars, like sustained, prolonged conflicts between different sectors of the society on more or less equal footing. We don't have anything remotely like that. Had there been another 100 police at that Capitol, they would have easily repelled those protesters, to say nothing of the full force of the United States government being deployed. So I think we have to be very careful to distinguish between threats that exist, but not going to the other extreme of trying to describe it in maximalist terms. The way that you convince fellow citizens of things that that what they believe is misguided or irrational or baseless is by convincing them, by persuading them, by telling them that the evidence that they have and that they think they've seen is not real. You can't do it through force. You can't simply say, we're going to silence you. We're going to force you to swallow the things that we think, because human beings don't accept that. They accept persuasion. And it's not a perfect solution. It doesn't mean that there won't still be people left who think these things, but there is no perfect solution. Empowering the government is also not perfect. And so I think the issue always is threat assessment. How much of a threat is this really to the things that we're being told are threatened by it?
Thank you. That was our last question. This was an extremely informative and extremely interesting talk and interview, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you, Mr. Glenn Greenwald, for joining us tonight. I would also like to thank all of our audience. We never drop below 100 people. I would like to again thank Darshana Griggs and Catherine Dara for all of the help they did. They work with event operations at Dartmouth. I would like to thank our treasurer, Mac Reeferson, who worked on the back end to make everything smooth and helped with the questions. Our president, William Riker, our membership director, Selena Noor, and our web director, Sudarshan Balasubramani. To be in touch with the DPU, please use the link that Mac just listed, or use any of the links that you will see on the slide in just a few moments. You can join our GroupMe, follow us on Instagram, and a lot else. This will be uploaded on YouTube, so if you ever wish to revisit it, feel free to. We hope to see you soon, and it was our honor having you with us.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks once again for the invitation, and thanks to everybody who asked questions. I really enjoyed the conversation. Have a good night.